Welcome to this online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, or ACB. My name is Brian Groyle, and I'm president of the ACB, which is part of the American Scientific Affiliation. The ASA is a Christian organization of scientists, engineers, theologians, and individuals in allied fields who engage in respectful dialogue on issues at the interface of faith and science. Tonight, we are delighted to have Dr. Cy Garte as our guest speaker. Dr. Garte has a PhD in biochemistry and has been a tenured professor at New York University, Rutgers University, and the University of Pittsburgh, as well as division director at the Center for Scientific Review of the National Institutes of Health and interim vice president for research at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. He is currently visiting professor of pharmacology and toxicology at Rutgers University. Dr. Garte has published more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, a book in 2019 entitled The Work of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith, and a book chapter in 2023 entitled A New Christian Meets New Atheism in the book Coming to Faith Through Dawkins that was edited by Dennis Alexander and Alistair McGrath. His next book is actually coming out in January 2024 and is entitled Science and Faith in Harmony, Contemplations on a Distilled Doxology. Dr. Garte is a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation and is editor-in-chief of ASA's online magazine, God and Nature. Tonight, he will share his personal faith story in a talk, My Blessed Journey from Atheism to Christianity. Cy, welcome to this event.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here. I believe I'm actually a charter founding member of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists. Joined right when you and Carl and others started it, so it's great to be.
Yeah, at least the current iteration of it. Yeah,
right, the current, right, and so it's a real honor to be invited to speak to all of you and to everyone else who's here from ASA and elsewhere. This talk is, as you heard Brian say, this is going to be about my faith journey, how I came during a very long period of time from my initial worldview, which I'll discuss in a few seconds, to being a Christian, a member of a church, and devoting my life actually to one particular aspect of Christian faith, which is trying to convey the message, which is being conveyed by many people, especially in the ASA, that science and Christian faith are not in conflict, but are in fact compatible with each other and enrich each other. And he mentioned the name of my second book coming out in January, which is basically all about that. And the idea being that science and Christian faith are in harmony, and harmony, for those of you who know anything about music, requires that you're not two voices are not singing, or not, two instruments are not playing the same notes. They play different melodies, but they harmonize beautifully with each other. And that's how I see the relationship between science and Christianity. So, however, I didn't start out as a Christian. My family were not Christians. They were not religious in any sense. Let's go to I'm going to go to the first slide. This is a sort of an overview of what my journey was like. My family, and that is not just my immediate family, but my extended family, for 3 generations were atheists. There was no celebration of any holidays, including Christmas, any other kind of holiday in my family. And that's how I started. I'm going to go into a little more detail about that. And then as I began my education in college as a chemistry major and eventually studying biochemistry in grad school, I kind of moved away from that very strong atheistic faith and consider myself an agnostic, and that lasted a good part of my life. I was one of those people who didn't know, didn't particularly care, and wasn't particularly interested in the whole question of God. And then, and I'm going to talk about this in quite a bit more detail. Several things happened to me in addition to what I learned from science, which, as I said, broke the wall of atheism that I had been believing up till then. But several other things happened, especially the intrusion of the Holy Spirit into my life, which eventually led me to accept Christianity. And so I'm going to go into that a little bit more detail. So as a child and a young adult, I grew up in a family of both my parents had been members of the Communist Party in the 30s. My grandparents were all communists. My grandfather was the founder of a union and in Massachusetts and Boston area, where my family's originally from. And several other members of the family were very active in the communist cause. One great uncle fought in the Russian Revolution. And there are members of my family who started unions or were active in unions, etc. And my parents had left the party once they moved to New York, where I was born, right after the war. But they still remained pretty faithful, especially my mother, in communist causes, left-wing causes. And so as a child, I was given a lot of translated Russian books to read. I didn't read Russian. I was sent to very left-wing camps. There's quite a few on the East Coast that everybody knew and knows were basically communist owned and led. And that very far left attitude continued as I got into college in the 60s. And I became a fairly active radical in college in the late 60s. My general worldview was a hatred of religion. I never went into any church or any kind of house of worship. I just, to me, that was something I wouldn't even think of. On the other hand, I found myself really loving science. My father was a chemist, and so there was some obvious connection there, and I loved chemistry. Actually, I started out as a biology major, but there was too much memorization, and everybody I knew was a pre-med student, which I was not, and so it was too difficult. I didn't like biology, and I switched to chemistry, where I was quite happy, and then eventually, was able to tear myself away from parental influence just enough to become a biochemist rather than a straight chemist. At the same time, although at the time that happened, I would not have acknowledged this, I was having some strange experiences, feelings that I couldn't understand. These are fairly, I'm not going to go into them because it would take too long, but now I see them as what I'm sure they were, which was calls from the Holy Spirit, which I ignored. Although I felt them, I was aware of them, but I didn't pay any attention to them. So these were my childhood heroes growing up. They may look familiar to you, Karl Marx. I don't know who the second one is, but anyway, Lenin and Stalin. You might be shocked at the inclusion of Stalin, but my parents were active Stalinists. They even despite Khrushchev's revelations in the 50s, they still believed that Comrade Stalin, well, especially my mother, again, she was the more hardliner. She believed that Comrade Stalin was, the hero of humanity. Of course, I had other heroes as a child, too. I grew up in Brooklyn, and so, of course, the Brooklyn Dodgers were, as a team, were my main heroes. And that, of course, dates me, but I actually happened to see the Dodgers win their first and only World Series in 1955. I watched it on television. So that tells you how old I am. These folks were my other heroes in the sense that I was completely convinced that they were their ideas represented the salvation of humanity, which everyone agreed, not just Christians, but certainly everybody else agreed that humans were in deep trouble and there had to be a solution, and this was it. By the way, I left that view before I left atheism due to world events, which were pretty dramatic. So at that point, I would have not checked other but atheist if someone had asked me what my worldview was. So I wasn't just a nun, I was an actual atheist. And since there are many definitions of atheism, some people like to say that atheism is simply not believing in God because there was not enough evidence for God, and so I just don't believe. That was not me. I was quite sure that there is no God. So I was the kind of atheist that some very famous people like Richard Dawkins and Hitchens are. They know there's no God, and that was me too. So I didn't even think about it very much. I just thought the belief in God was a silly, I don't know, soporific for fairly dumb people who just didn't know anything, and it wasn't even worth discussing. And I never really discussed it. That was a little tricky for me because I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood of Brooklyn, where everybody, all the kids on the block, went to parochial school, and this was before Vatican II. And so, Catholic education was somewhat, I would say, regressive at that point. So there was a lot of contrast between my views and those of most of my friends, but that's a whole nother story, which I won't get into here. So what happened then? Well, what happened was that I was, as a chemistry major, I began studying a little bit of physics. I mean, to do physical chemistry, you have to you have to deal with the Schrodinger equation and some other things, which at the time was fine. I didn't really think about it much. But after I was over that, and after I had finished all the coursework, and I started thinking about, what some of this physics that I had learned meant, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I certainly completely believed in complete determinism, which included a view of reductionism. Everything could be reduced to materialistic and naturalistic causes. The natural laws of the universe govern everything. There were no exceptions, which is something you hear a lot of, or I hear a lot of these days as well, from atheists, especially atheists who are not actually scientists. But it's kind of hard to hold to those strict views once you learn a lot about physics and chemistry, especially when you learn a lot about biology, at least in my view. And so eventually I started wondering about some of those beliefs. And I even came to believe that there might be something else beyond pure rationality. And of course, that included everything from humor and love and all the things that make us human. And it didn't bring me to any kind of faith, but it did raise the question, what is that something else that is, beyond what science can tell us? And I think most people, including atheists who are truly intelligent and rational, do come to that conclusion because they experience that kind of thing all the time. And that was helped by no less than my father, a very strong atheist, who was a scientist, a chemist, and he told me that very clearly that not every question can be answered by science. And, that was a strong blow to my scientism, which I had before that. And I think the majority of scientists would agree with that, even those who claim that they have no interest in anything other than science. And so eventually, and it was also the 60s when there was a lot of new stuff going on related to spirituality and other ways of finding a truth. And so I got into that a little bit. I looked into some forms of spirituality. I looked into Buddhism, which was completely over my head and still is. I have no idea what Buddhism is about. I never spent enough time or energy exploring it. I just looked and left. And I looked at some other things, the whole New Age story that was very big in the late 60s and the 70s, some of the other Eastern religions. Nothing really grabbed me. My family, although none of the people I knew had ever practiced any religion, but my family was of Jewish origin. And at one point, I even considered, when I started getting more serious about the possibility of a religious faith, I looked into Judaism as well. And again, it just didn't, ring any bells for me. But I would have considered myself at that point, and when I say adult, I'm meaning somewhere between, getting my PhD in my mid to late 20s and all the way through my 30s and beginning a family and into my early 40s. I would have called myself an agnostic. And then a few things happened, which again gradually kind of started bringing me around a little more. And one of those things was that I finally went to a church for the first time in my life. I was in my early 40s, early to middle 40s, and a friend asked me to go to a church with her, and this was a Catholic church. I had never before been in a church, except I think one time I had been in a church for the Riverside Church in New York for a concert, of the Messiah. That's the only time I'd ever walked inside a church. So I went to a mass, a church service, which was terrifying to me. The idea of actually walking into a church, I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought I thought it was going to be scary. People would start yelling at me, stoning me for being, an apostate, whatever. I mean, I didn't even know what the words meant, but for being an atheist. And it was a pleasant surprise because everyone was quite friendly. The priest gave a sermon about love, and I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting to hear about sin and, terrible things, but it was actually quite pleasant. Everybody shook my hand. Well, not everybody. People shook each other's hand, and several people around me shook my hand and wished me peace. And that was kind of nice. Nothing what I expected at all. Certainly not what I had heard as a youth about what the evils of the Catholics, who were the worst people on earth, according to what I had heard. And there was some reading of the Bible, which I had only looked at a little bit as part of a class in college. I don't even remember which course it was, but there was a little bit of gospel reading, and now I decided I should look into this a little more, and I read the Gospel of St. Matthew, which I found. I guess I could say what I found about it was that it was not fake. I had obviously grown with the concept that the Bible was all false, of course, but also that it was made up. There was no Jesus. There was no there was nothing to any of it. And that didn't really jive with what I read in the book of Matthew. It didn't sound like anybody had made that up. And my favorite subject actually in school was not science, but history. And I love history to this day, and I read it for fun. And when I read the book of Acts, which was the second book I read, I saw that was history. That was not made up. And there were lots of clues to that. And that really struck me as, okay, this could be real in some way. Okay. I really wondered about that. Now, before I go further, I want to illustrate a little bit about what I meant by science, the science that I was learning, bringing me away from my very strict atheism, the certainty that there could not be a God, and that only rational and easily understood deterministic reality was what was real. And of course, the Schrodinger equation, which I actually had to solve on a test in physical chemistry, was at the time I just plugged in numbers and solved it. But later, this first term here in the Schrodinger equation, the little I, is the square root of -1. It's called an imaginary number because there is no square root of -1. Well, there is, but anyway, I'm not going to go into details. But the whole idea that there's something called an imaginary number, which exists as the basis of understanding wave equations and the reality of particles and everything else, struck me as kind of strange. And just a little side note here, I don't know if anyone else is aware of this, but in atheist circles, there's a very famous meme. It's kind of fallen away, but I still see it now and then, which says God is equal to the square root of -1, meaning that God is imaginary. And I posted a meme a while back saying, well, thank you, atheists, because since the square root of -1 is the first term in the Schrodinger equation, you're admitting that God is the basis of all reality. So yes, I agree. So that was something. And then of course, these things, I didn't really study these in college, but I read about them later. And that is the whole idea of particles, electrons, for example, being both waves and particles at the same time, which makes no sense. It's certainly real. It's certainly true. And the observer effect, which is that when you observe something, a particle, instead of being all over the place, localizes into a particular spot. Neither of those things, fit into my concept of what is rational and what is, clearly makes sense. And of course, I don't have to tell this audience, but, it's been said many times that if you say you understand quantum mechanics, you don't. And that's been said by many physicists. And I didn't. And but that had a real effect on me. If that's the case, then maybe there are other things that don't seem to make sense, which may also be true. Okay, it doesn't rule out the reality of everything that isn't logically and rationally obvious and easy to understand. Because look at this. This is science. This is true. And the last thing, which I found very interesting, was the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, a simple equation there on the left. And what it says is what Heisenberg said, or somebody wrote that: the more you know about, the more you know about where an electron is, the less you can be certain about where it's going. And the more you are certain about where it's going, the less you know about where it is. So that's fascinating. That was fascinating to me, because what it said is that science tells us we cannot know everything. There are things that we cannot know. And, if we, and that is both at the same time, the position and the momentum of an electron, we can't know that. And it's not because we need more research. It's not because, maybe someday we will find that. No, this is the bedrock of modern physics, and it's why we're talking to each other the way we are and why we have cell phones and everything else. So that's true, and that came as an interesting shock to me, because that also implied that maybe there are other things that we cannot know for certain that may still be true. Okay, the electron is somewhere, we just don't know where it is. So then I began studying biochemistry, and at the time I was studying this, one didn't really learn much about the genetic code and about the way proteins are made in undergrad biology. But in graduate school, of course, I learned all the details, and it was stunning. I remember listening to a lecture on protein synthesis, on how the ribosomes work and how the genetic code works. And I just felt chills going up and down my spine. And I was just thinking, wait, really? So what we have in biology and biochemistry is this example of abstract information. In other words, information is a very complicated topic. And if Randy were here, Randy Isaac were here, he would tell you that there's information everywhere. And that's a physicist's definition of information, which is not what we mean when we talk about the information in the genetic code. The kind of information that's in the genetic code is the same kind of information that we use as human beings when we talk. In other words, we use words which symbolize information. Okay, so a tree, the word tree has nothing to do with a tall wooden plant. It's a symbol for the plant, and it's different in different languages. And it turns out that's true in life. The structure on the left, which is part of DNA, and in fact, it's 3 base pairs, adenine, cytosine, and thymidine, those 3 base pairs, those 3 nucleotides has a meaning, and it means an amino acid. In this case, ACT means threonine, with the structure on the upper right. And what do I mean when I say it means threonine? How does a chemical mean something? Well, most chemicals don't mean anything, but these do. And what it means in reality is, I see you're making a protein. When I come along, me being ACT, I'm telling you, put threonine next in the protein structure. That's what it means. It's an instruction. It's an informational instruction, and that's the basis, not only of life, but it's the basis of evolution. It's the basis of actually all of biology, this code, which is the first code in the universe, as far as we know. So that really got me. And I started wondering about, okay, is this something we can explain? Is this something that maybe, points to a divinity? I had no idea. I'm showing one more example of the complexity of biology. This is something I've actually done a little work on, theoretical work on earlier. And this is the whole concept of gene expression regulation. Gene regulatory pathways, this is one of the simplest. It's in a very primitive organism. If we looked at a gene regulatory pathway in us or in any mammal, it would be 10 times the complexity. And what it means simply is that what we have in every cells of our body, we have genes which turn on other genes or turn them off. They inhibit their expression. So in this case, for example, the MYC gene, the MAT-NB, and the DAC gene turn on one gene, which turns on one gene, which turns on a whole bunch, some of which turn on other genes, some of which inhibit genes. There's feedback inhibition. It gets incredibly complicated. And this level of complexity, which you can find in almost every aspect of biology and biochemistry, it's staggering, and it is. I don't say that it's an indication of divine intervention. I don't believe in intelligent design, but it is something that made me, as an agnostic, think, what's going on here? How did all this come about? And I looked into it and couldn't tell. But the reality is, none of that scientific information brought me to faith. It gave me a lot of pause for thinking. Even going to church, and I went back a few times, and it was fine. I liked it. Right, reading the Bible didn't do it. It was too hard for me to take that final step and say, okay, I believe, because I just had my entire life, 50 years of just rejecting any possibility that anything supernatural could be real. And I now believe that, God had been calling me for a long time, and things happened which did eventually drag me kicking and screaming over the threshold of faith. And I'm not going to go into great detail about those. I have talked about them online. There are videos where I discuss them. They're described in detail in chapter 9 of my first book. Many of you have probably already heard me talk about them. I'll just say there were 2 or 3 dreams that I didn't understand when I had them, but later became very clear that they were about direct experience of Jesus. And the final thing, which, even though those dreams were very important to me and very profound, they didn't quite do it either. But one day when I was quite ready, I guess, I was driving alone on a long distance trip, and I had an encounter with the Holy Spirit directly. And I found myself, since he gave a sermon, I found myself speaking to myself in terms of a sermon, preaching. And that was so powerful that I stopped the car, began crying uncontrollably, and I said out loud, "I believe." And from that moment, I was a believer in Jesus. What happened next? Well, very little. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't know who to tell. I didn't know any Christians. Well, I knew a couple, but I wasn't in great touch with them. I didn't know what to do, and I just kept it to myself pretty much. I was still working as a professor. At this point, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I did nothing for quite some time. Finally, in the year 2010, somehow or other, I saw something online about a meeting near me in Washington, D.C. It was at a Catholic university. It was a meeting of a group I'd never heard of called the American Scientific Affiliation. And they were going to be talking about science and faith. And I thought to myself, wow, there are other scientists who believe in Jesus. I didn't know that. I really didn't. The only one I knew who was a Christian and a scientist was the author of The Language of God, Francis Collins, and I thought he and I were the only two. But I did go to that meeting in 2010, and I met many people, including some who are here today. And it changed my life completely, and I realized that I wasn't crazy. I didn't have to stay, in the shadows. I didn't have to make sure I didn't tell anybody that I was this nutcase who was doing scientific research and also believed in Jesus Christ. And so a couple of years later, I went to a church, a Protestant church, and was baptized the next week at the age of 65. And at that point, excuse me, I became active in the church and also in what I discovered was the wonderful, the only word is beautiful, community of science and faith. Almost everyone here is a member, and many, many more who I've met. And a few years later, I retired from active academic research and pretty much devoted the rest of my life to that endeavor of trying to bring the word of science and faith harmony to the world. And I'm going to show you some examples of what I've been doing. These are some talks that some of the talks that I've given in the last, 10 years or so, and online, and a few of them in person at meetings, at conferences. A lot of it, as you see, is related to design, evolution, biology, biochemistry, and general topics. I've published a number of papers in the ASA Journal, PSCF. Here are the titles of those with the dates. The first one was in 2013, and some more recently. I've also done some other book reviews and a few other things in PSCF. And in fact, I'm on the board of that journal. Jim Peterson is the editor. And I've had other articles published more recently in magazines, including Christianity Today, and God and Nature, which as Brian said, I'm now editor-in-chief, has published my articles again, starting in 2013, and up until the present, I published a few articles even after I became editor-in-chief. And at the same time, after I retired from academic work, I actually got a small grant from the John Templeton Foundation to continue doing some research. And even when that finished, I kept doing research. Now, of course, now I don't have a laboratory, didn't have a laboratory, so I was able to indulge something I've always been interested in, which is theoretical biology. And here are some titles of a few papers. The most recent came out earlier this year in Acta Biotheoretica. And I would say this journal, Biocosmos, is a new journal. I'm on the board there, the editorial board, and it's a very interesting journal, which I can talk about if anyone's interested later. So what am I talking about? What are my themes? What am I trying to get across? And there are several areas that I think are currently unknown. And I think some of those areas might be able to provide pointers to God, analogous to the kinds of scientific knowledge we have, for example, related to the fine-tuning of the physical constants in cosmology, which appear to be, fine-tuned deliberately, and has often been called the best argument for the existence of God by both Christians and by many atheists, who have other answers for how that could be true, but who are still who still recognize that is a strong argument for divine intervention. In biology, I include the origin of life as a major thing that is really incredibly difficult and resistant to simple explanation. Consciousness, we don't even know really what it is. It's very hard to explain it or understand it. Human behavior, which includes altruism and morality, has been glibly assigned to evolution, but there are many problems with that. When we talk about biological evolution, and that, to me, that also those things are pointers to our soul. And then there are other things which are a little more technical, such as convergence, the origin of genetic coding, and of some of the biological machinery, all of which may or may not be pointers to a divine design. So where do we go with that? With all those unknowns? Well, first we have to establish that there are such gaps in biological understanding, and every biologist knows that. Many atheists sort of deny it, but that's silly because they don't know enough to understand the magnitude of some of these gaps. But I am not someone who holds to intelligent design. Notice I said divine design, which is not the same as intelligent design. I do believe that eventually we will find natural laws that explain all of those unknown things. And by the way, although James Tour, who's a friend of mine, is often accused of being an advocate of ID, he agrees with what I just said. He agrees that eventually we will find the answers, but we're not on the verge of finding them right now, and that's true. But what I would like to say is that we need new laws. Evolution is something which most people here know that I fully support and hold to be true, but it is not a complete theory. I mean, that is clearly the case. There are many things that evolution does not address, cannot address, and shouldn't address, but they're still related to biology. And we need either to complete the theory of evolution, which is actually happening as we speak. There's some amazingly interesting new ideas that are coming out about consciousness and teleology and agency, all of that, all of this in purely scientific, mainstream, non-theistic journals and scientists. And these new laws and new theories of biology are going to happen. And my view and my faith is that some of these will provide pointers to the divine, original divine design and creation of life, as we now, as Christians, believe that God is the creator of everything, and we have some details, such as the question of the constants of nature, of the laws of nature being designed, and I believe that will happen in biology as well. So what I'm saying is that if we assume that life began as a series of, or if trying to say that life began as a series of complex chemical reactions that, quote, eventually evolved into a living cell, it's not actually fallacious in terms of logic, but it is not scientifically valid. Eventually evolved is not a scientific term, and I'm about to submit a paper that proves mathematically that statement is false. And I'm not going to say any more about that now, obviously, but there are things you need for evolution. It just doesn't happen spontaneously. And so I started thinking, and I still believe that the origin of life must have involved something in addition to what we now know as theories and laws. And I think that that's needed to go further in biological progress. And I will conclude with this takeoff of a very famous quote from Richard Dawkins, who talks about the universe having no purpose, no good, no evil, etc. And what I say instead is that science is telling us that the universe that we observe has the properties, precisely the properties, including life, that we should expect if there is at bottom a grand design, a purpose, such as the existence of life that can worship its creator, good and evil, and all that is needed to justify belief in the presence of God. So it's a twist on the Dawkins quote, which I much prefer. And Brian mentioned all of these books. Thank you, Brian. The Works of His Hands has been out since 2019. It is a prize winner. And the book Coming to Faith through Dawkins, edited by Dennis and Alistair, is a great book. I wouldn't have said that until I actually got it, because I hadn't read, I'd only read one or two other chapters other than my own, one of which is by my wife, who's with us tonight. And this book is really interesting and puts, along with some other recent books, one by Justin Brierley and a couple of others, kind of indicates that new atheism is on the way out, if it isn't out already. And I think that's good news. And finally, again, as Brian mentioned, my second book, Science and Faith in Harmony, which is quite different from the first, has no personal testimony. It's really about what it says. It's about how many different areas of science are in strong harmony with Christian faith. And that will be out. It's available for pre-order, but it won't be out until late January of next year. And I'm going to stop here and answer any questions that may come up.
Thank you, Cy, for that really compelling testimony. So we'd like to open it up for Q&A. Carlos.
Cy, can you recall any instances where once you became a Christian, that affected your research, its rationale, its hypotheses, methods, results, conclusions?
I'm sorry. Just this part of that I missed. Could you just say that?
Okay.
Again?
So can is there any instance that you can think of where becoming a Christian affected how you did science?
Right. That's what I thought. No, I can't think of a single instance of that. And frankly, that has come up a few times in my discussions with atheists who inform me that, faith doesn't belong in the laboratory. And I agree. When you're doing science, you're doing science. And there are rules on how to do science, and there are methods, and that's what you do. And praying for an experiment to work, that's something I've done, but everybody does that, including atheists. I mean, especially if if a lot depends on it, so which often happens. But no, other than that, it has not had any effect on my scientific work.
Daryl Davidson, good to see you here.
Did your family have any reaction to your change of your deviation from communism and atheism? Were they offended?
Yeah, well, the communism thing happened fairly early in my life, and they weren't offended. I was still fairly left wing, so I didn't become a quote reactionary, politically, but so I don't think they didn't give me any harsh feedback on that. They didn't know about my coming to Christian faith. They had both passed on by then. But I do have a sister who's older, and she's perfectly happy with it. She's also no longer either communist or atheist. So I did have some raised eyebrows from all my friends. All my friends were atheists. I mean, I didn't know any other Christians. But I didn't try to. I was a very passive Christian. I didn't use apologetics on anyone. I didn't try to convert anyone. I just said, well, I happen to be a Christian. And oh, really? Oh, okay. That's it. So I didn't experience, well, I shouldn't say none. I had a couple of minor issues with some of my supervisors when I was working at NIH. But at that time, Francis Collins was my boss's boss. So they couldn't say too much. So anyway, yeah. But I've heard other stories, but I did not have a major negative pushback from anybody.
In your book, you mentioned before the fine tuning argument for God, and you mentioned that in your book as well, and that you sort of outlined three possible solutions to the mystery of the fine tuning argument, with the third one being God, and the other two you sort of alluded to that there were other possibilities that non-scientists or non-Christians might embrace. But you embraced God as the explanation. But then in the chapter that you wrote, in talking about the anthropic principle, which encompasses the idea of fine-tuning, you said that you didn't think that the anthropic principle is in any way relevant to the existence of God. That seems like a contradiction. Could you unpack that for us a bit?
Well, what is the anthropic principle? What does it actually say? What it says is, of course, it's kind of like that puddle story from Adams. The anthropic principle says, as far as I understand it, the strong version of it is that, the only universe we could possibly live in would be one that has all those laws with all the constants. If we had a universe where there were no stars, or no hydrogen or whatever would be the case, or that it expanded too quickly or not enough, or the gravitation was too strong or not strong enough, we wouldn't be here. So we wouldn't know. So we have to be in this one. Yeah, that is true, but it says nothing about the fine-tuning argument. And the reason is It's kind of like people say, well, if you get a a full house or a royal flush of spades, okay, royal flush of spades, the best hard hand you can get, the chances of getting that hand are no different than the chances of getting any other hand. So it's not a big deal. However, that's not what fine tuning is about. What fine tuning is about is that the royal flush of spades, if you get dealt that hand, that's the only one that will allow you to live. If you get any other hand, you're killed. That's the fine tuning argument. And the fact is that, you could get any hand you want, but the odds of getting the single hand that will allow you to survive are so small, you can't count on it to happen. And of course, the odds, if you add all the odds up with the fine tuning of the physical constants, it makes a royal flush of spades look easy to get. And that's the point of fine tuning. If there's only one universe, okay, that's the if. If there's only one universe and it could have any of the constants that are possible, there's no way we would be here unless it had, an infinite number of times to try and we finally got the right one, which is a version of the multiverse, which is the main other possibility. And the multiverse is mathematically interesting to physicists. I can't talk about it. I'm not a physicist, but I do know that there are some other reasons related to quantum theory that might suggest a multiverse. But we have no more evidence for a multiverse than we have for God. It's a hypothetical construct. So I think I think atheists who decide that they're going to invoke the multiverse to explain fine tuning, fine. I mean, that's okay, but it's no better than invoking the existence of God.
Suppose by chance, if I can follow up on that, that someone finds a way to gain evidence for a multiverse. Mm-hmm. Seems unlikely, but what if it happened? Would that shake your belief that God was responsible for the?
Well, as has often been said, if the multiverse is true, is real, then we have the problem of explaining its existence. How did that happen? So it would be interesting. It would do away with the fine tuning argument as it stands for the existence of God, but it wouldn't disprove God because you still have this question of where did the multiverse come from. And there's some other arguments that I've read, which I don't remember very well, but there's a physicist, I believe his name is Holder, who has done some calculations on multiverse probability, and it's not encouraging. So, but that's all I can say. I don't remember the details. It's way out of my field.
John Wood.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Cy. This is a delight. I have your book and I've glanced at it, and it's in my list of to-dos. So, but I really like to hear things. So having your voice is really helpful. So thank you. Just so many different questions come to mind, but I want to zero in on this one, and it's your experience. And I'm thinking about Elaine Eklund's work with her graduate students. They're atheist, and there are, you've kind of talked about Dawkins and the new atheist, but there's a lot of other kinds apparently. She categorizes, I think, 4 different kinds. And as you were talking, I was reminded, I'm sure we all did this. We go through our own life experience, right? And how God chased us each down. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of the Jesus revolution. So what's your experience with atheists, with others in these conversations? Maybe you haven't had that many conversations.
Oh, yes, I have.
Okay. So could you tell us a bit more about that? That would be interesting.
Well, I've had several conversations with Aaron Ra, who is one particular kind of atheist. We're actually on pretty good terms. He's thrilled that there is a Christian who believes that evolution is true. I keep telling him there are lots, but we've had some interesting discussions. I've also co-hosted a show with Paul Enns, who goes by Pauloja, who's an online atheist. And we were talking about evolution versus some of the ideas of the Creation Institute and Answers in Genesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've had other. In fact, in day after tomorrow, I'm doing an interview with a agnostic, and I've done a few others with agnostic and atheists. And yes, there are many different kinds. I absolutely agree with that. My main experience currently is not with the good kind, because I'm pretty active on Twitter or X or whatever it is, and sometimes I post something and I get 60 or 80 or more comments, which I have to block because they're not very nice. But I think that's one type. Some of those may even be bots. Some of them may be teenagers. I don't know. Again, Ben Watkins, who's a pretty active atheist online, I've met. He was at a Christian conference. Great guy, very smart. And there are many others of that type who are well-known scholars. So that's the group that are fun to talk with. Sometimes they have good arguments. Back to Aaron Ra, the problem I have with him is his definition of evidence, and I've been trying to educate him as to what is evidence and what isn't. So it's interesting. The thing about this book, which came out just in time because it's going to be outdated in a couple of years, I think, is that, the new atheism was a very sort of shocking and aggressive form of atheism, and that's gone away. I mean, very few people are, really following Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or some of the others who've come along since then very closely for lots of reasons. A lot of atheists seem to have been dropping this whole thing about worrying about Christians as the main enemy to anything. They're worried about other things instead. Political issues, other religious issues, social issues. The world is crazy these days. I don't have to tell anybody that. And, people are, I think the impression I'm getting, it's kind of I can't back it up with any facts like Elaine Eklund does, but the impression I'm getting is that, atheists are no longer as upset and as worried and as, spending as much effort and energy at fighting Christianity as they used to.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. I think Daryl has his hand raised, Brian. If you go light, I want to come back to what Carlos asked and ask it a different way, but I'll let others go forward here first.
Well, actually, it looks like someone at Multnomah University is next in line, so we'll let them ask their question. Sarah Gall?
Yeah. Hi, thanks. We had a question from somebody in our audience. Aside from your experiences with the Holy Spirit, what about Christianity was more compelling to you compared to the other religions you looked into?
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm so happy you asked it. And the answer is very simple. Jesus Christ. When I began to understand the reality of what the Gospels are saying, I had the same reaction probably that the disciples had. This is amazing. God looked down on the earth and had mercy and pity on us and came to earth to tell us directly. God told us directly what we were doing wrong and how we could do things right. And it was a revolutionary message that even today has not been fully, as we know, has not been fully followed. But it made a huge difference in the historical trends of humanity. And it changed the world. And that's a general way of looking at it. But the figure of Jesus Christ as God incarnated into a human being, into a man who loves us, was just swept me away. And my sermon that I mentioned, the thing that I said out well to myself, but acting as if I was talking to an audience. I'd been listening to a Christian radio station while I was driving, and I turned it off and I said, "Gee, I wonder what it would be like to give a sermon." And that was crazy anyway, but I started preaching the sermon, and what the sermon was all about, and this did not come from me, this came from outside. What the sermon was all about was that Jesus loves all of you because I know that he loves me. And if he could love even me, there's no one that he would not love. And when I said those words, that was it. And that's the basis of my faith. So it's the person of Jesus Christ, which does, I don't know, that there's no such person in any other religion that I have found.
Thank you.
Daryl Davidson.
I feel like my question may be disappointing after your explanation of your faith and your sermon. I wondered what you preached to yourself. But I was a little bit, I'm still wondering what, if you could elaborate a little bit about the difference between divine intelligence and intelligent design.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. So intelligent design, I don't think intelligent design is, quote, wrong. I think it's an idea. Well, first of all, there's no one single view of intelligent design. There are many people in the ID movement with very different views. Some actually accept, like Michael Denton, accept evolution as a viable mechanism for diversity of life. Others don't. The real problem with intelligent design is it basically says we have the proof of God, or at least very strong evidence for God, based on the fact that, you know, there's no other explanation for the origin of life. There are no other explanations for all the things that we don't understand, the genetic code. And I do agree that those gaps of knowledge, okay, are real. But I don't agree that I don't agree with the God of the gaps approach, obviously, because if you say, well, if we don't know something, I mean, this is the old argument that Francis has made, many people have made. If you say that we believe in God because we can't explain such and such any other way, then if that explanation comes around, where are you? You're stuck. You have no basis for your belief. And the real problem with intelligent design is I feel it's basically negative in tone. In other words, this is not true. That's not true. You know, we can't get origin of life this way. We can't get consciousness that way. So, God. I would say the same. I start with the same premise, but I say, so we need more work. We need more scientific ideas. We need to understand, you know, how, for example, evolution is something, it turns out, I'm going to give you a preview now of what I'm going to be publishing soon. Evolution is not the bedrock of biological science because it automatically follows from something else, which is replication, self-replication at high accuracy. And when you have that, you get evolution. If you don't have that, you cannot have evolution. So it's necessary and sufficient. We don't know how accurate self-replication came to be. It did not evolve by natural selection. It could not evolve by natural selection because it's required for natural selection. Okay. And therefore, we need new things. That's why I said evolution is not complete. We need new ideas, and those ideas are coming. They're coming from all over, and they're not coming from theists. Dennis Noble, a very famous British physiologist, has been publishing about teleology, about purpose in biology, and more recently, and this is something that I find fascinating. People have been publishing something about what's now called cognition-based evolution. In other words, bacteria have cognition. Very primitive single-celled organisms have cognition. They communicate, they make decisions, they act, they have agency, not because of any laws of physics or chemistry, but because they are cognitive beings. Now, that's to me, that's unbelievable. That's remarkable. But there's evidence for that to be true. And it's been coming for several years. You can look up Bonnie Bassler, Bassler. She gave a TED talk about this, which was stunning when it came out, I think in 2016. But that was only the beginning. There have been a lot more papers on this, and that's where we need to go. We need to expand our horizons. I mean, you know, evolution, we know that evolution has taken on what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis, which has all kinds of new ways of thinking about mutations and, you know, gene amplification, other things. That's great. And that tells us that, you know, the very standard neo-Darwinian view needs expanding, and people have been doing that. But we need to go further. We need new ideas, new theories. And that is what I call divine design, because when we find that, that's going to point to God as the divine designer, because calling God an intelligent designer is an insult to God. He's not intelligent. He's way beyond intelligent. We're intelligent. God is way beyond that.
So then, as a scientific optimist, it sounds like if you filled in all of the gaps in that list that you gave us with better theories, new laws, your faith wouldn't be shaken at all.
Yeah, you're right. And the reason is the more we learn in physics, the more God looks real. And I'm saying biology is once again trying to catch up with physics, as it always does. And we're going to catch up, and we're going to find the same thing as we get to these new facts.
Si, I put a point in the chat. You won't have seen it, but the rest of the people can see it. A paper just came out. You're a prophet, sir. The paper I just showed up today in PNAS on the roles of function and selection in evolving systems. Yeah. Which doesn't say much, but what they're really trying to do is they're saying, listen, we have a new law,
right?
A new law that incorporates all of these laws, basic laws that don't do enough. I haven't even read the thing yet. I just copied it down.
This is booming. It just started in 2021. I mean, it started earlier, but the boom started in 2021, and there's so many papers. About this that it's fantastic.
So I mean, I think one of the lessons from this talk tonight is we'll take a hockey example. Wayne Gretzky used to say here in Edmonton, you skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. This is where the conversation in science is going. It's where the debate is. You're right. The new atheist debate is not even, scientists don't really care about that. Right. But they do care about the kinds of questions that you're raising here. That bacterial stuff, bacterial mentality or intelligence is part of that notion of quorum sensing and other things. Right. There's a rich theoretical and empirical literature there. And it seems to me that what it's asking us is really the question is, what is life? And you know, we've had this separation of, oh, we're humans over here and we're special and unique, and then there's everything else, and we're the ones that have mentality and we can think and rationality, and we're the only ones that have behavior, and on and on and on. And in fact, what we've discovered over the last 40, 50 years is that's actually not the case. The whole creation is out there, interacting
Right.
with itself and others. And there's some fresh new stuff on bacterial, the microbiomes of us, and really interesting stuff that says things like, we're not an individual, we're a community of beings.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, our very cells, once you get past DNA, and DNA is doing these marvelous things, you get things like eukaryotic cells. Well, they're actually a community, right?
Right.
Our best understanding. And so it seems to me that the doctrine that we ought to be looking at here is the notion of the Trinity, the relational nature of the Godhead that we see reflected in the creation coming back at us. And life is really fascinating.
Yes, it is. It is.
Feels like there's a fresh new place coming here. So thanks again for your. So the question. Sorry, I did it. Brian, you're gonna shoot me. Okay. The question. Back to what Carlos asked. He asked you, did you change anything on how you do your science because you're a Christian? I want to change that list a little bit because I think Terry Morrison, chemist in ASA years ago, said when you walk in the laboratory, you don't see Christian molecules on the lab bench. There are just molecules there. And so ask yourself this question, answer this one. The kinds of questions you ask, have they changed? Have the nature of your questions or the way you ask the questions, has that changed?
Yeah, that probably has, especially recently. Once I no longer have to, make sure I get grants. Okay, so I can do whatever I want now. It's cheap and free. I mean, I'm doing theoretical work. I don't need to buy anything.
Yeah.
So what I am I'm interested in theoretical biology in general. But I'm especially interested in the origin of life. That is something that I find fascinating. And if you remember some of the titles, 2 or 3 of them are related to this whole issue of what happened early on in the development of the first cell to Luca, which is a huge black box that we know nothing about. And I read the literature on that. I recently had some discussions with Charles Carter, who's one of the pioneers in that field. And it's a fascinating area of science, both for empirical and theoretical work. And yes, I would say that my faith has probably steered me a bit in that direction, although I think I've always been interested in theoretical biology. My first paper in it was published in 2004. So it's something I feel has been ignored. I was once at a scientific meeting, where I was not part of a small panel. This is many decades ago, and one of the members of the panel, who's quite well known, was asked a question about the theoretical aspect of something or other, and he said, "There's no theory in biology. It doesn't belong there." That was not an unusual opinion in those days. The idea was, well, us biologists, we get data. We don't fantasize about theory. That's for other people. Yeah. I don't know if that view is still held very much, but it was at the time, and I found it shocking and very unfortunate. It basically put biologists in a very different category of science where I don't think they belong. I think theoretical biology is critical. We don't have enough of it. And, now with the development of computer science, there are many more people doing systems biology and other theoretical biological work, which is really, really important and very productive. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes, it did make some difference, but I've always been in that direction.
Thank you. That's so helpful. So you stand in a long tradition of very elite biologists who were people of faith who say the same thing. George Washington Carver comes to mind, and a whole bunch of others who just say, God helps me. My faith helps me to ask better questions.
Yeah.
that's an encouragement to young scientists coming up. I know being at Berkeley, I never had to say anything about my faith. I just had to ask good questions and be there, with good answers. And then they would ask me, my colleagues and my faculty members would ask me about my faith.
Right.
And you just turn that around. So I think asking good questions is just vital. And faith really helps to expand the reach of the kinds of questions you can ask. Thanks for that.
Sarah Gall, I see in the chat you did ask a question that you didn't raise before. Did you want to bring that one up? The one about transhumanism?
Sure. That came from one of our audience members. And he was just curious what your thoughts were about transhumanism and that area.
Interesting. I'm actually one of the early signatories to a petition which was started by a humanist group. I don't remember the name now. This goes back many, many years. To be careful. I don't remember exactly the wording, but it was something that let's be cautious about transhumanism. I think it came out around the time of the first attempt at human cloning, which was, I don't know what, 20 years ago. I don't remember. Okay, so transhumanism is something I am both skeptical and worried about. I think that we're pretty, I was going to say we're pretty trans, but that has other meanings now. So I say we're pretty much above the rest of life already. And this whole idea that we can, engineer humanity to a certain purpose, I always have found dangerous, because knowing biology, the first thing you find out is that, making engineering changes to organisms is not something that's easy to do, especially to humans, while avoiding any negative effects. So I also don't really think it's possible, frankly, even with gene editing. I mean, what you find out when you study biology is that the complexity of genes, for example, there are genes that do very small, tiny little things that you would never think about. They code for proteins, for enzymes, which are not the whole thing, but they're part of a very small pathway involving, for example, the synthesis of a nucleotide. Okay. And if that gene is missing, you get horrendous diseases, a horrendous disease in particular. Why? Nobody knows. Because it's the way that enzyme made by that gene interacts with so many other enzymes and so many other metabolic pathways is beyond our comprehension. At the same time, you can take away huge numbers of genes from living organisms and nothing happens. They're perfectly fine. They don't care. So one gene can cause a series of horrendous phenotypic consequences, including mental retardation, paralysis, pain. One protein. On the other hand, you can remove 1,000 proteins from the human genome or from any genome, and nothing happens at all. So what does that tell you? That tells you that it's not easy to re-engineer life. It's extremely difficult because of this incredible complexity. So I'm very skeptical about it. I don't think it's a good idea, even if we could do it, because humans are human. And, the first case, of course, which is already here, is the idea of sex selection. Okay. So there are societies where even now, people are selecting male babies versus female babies. Okay. What are the social implications of that? They're horrendous. Okay. If you have a society where you now have 80% males versus females, you think that has no effect on life, on social life? I mean, that's disastrous. And that's easy to do. I mean, it's done right now with selective abortions in some places. So what are you going to do if you now make everybody, quote, smarter or stronger? We don't even know what those words mean. So I'm very negative about transhumanism for many reasons. First, I think it doesn't work. Second, I think it's a terrible idea if it did work. And we've got enough problems dealing with AI right now. We don't need living examples of AI. So, yeah, I'm against it, as Groucho would say.
So I thank you for spending this time with us this evening. And if you like what you've heard and you want more of it, I'd highly recommend his book, The Work of His Hands. And we look forward to seeing your next book that's coming out at the end of January. So that concludes our session. I'd like to conclude officially in prayer, and I'd like to ask Carl Pinkham, the Vice President for the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, to lead us in prayer.
Let's bow. Precious Heavenly Father, we thank you for Cy, for his enlightening presentation this evening. And we thank you for the people who conceived, arranged, and promoted it. We especially thank you for the attendees and their insightful questions and comments. And may they go away from this evening with new insights, challenges, and commissions. Bless all who are involved. Bless the American Scientific Affiliation and the Affiliation of Christian Biologists. And especially, Lord, we ask you to protect Israel and the innocent people in Gaza during this critical time of world tension. And we pray all of this in the precious name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you all, and have a good rest of the week, and stay tuned for more events, upcoming events hosted by the Affiliation of Christian Biologists.